The inauguration of a new CLACS faculty working group entitled Racisms in Comparative Perspective. The group, which is launched by CLACS professor Carmen Medeiros and CLACS visiting scholar Pamela Caya, aims to discuss the possibilities and relevance of comparing racisms in the Americas first, and also to explore the usefulness of such comparisons for anti-racist action at different levels. So I thank Carmen and Pamela for all their work starting the group and for organizing tonight's lecture. We're very pleased to launch the endeavor with the visit of Professor Charles Hale, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Teresa Lozano Institute of Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Hale is the author of many important works, including Resistance and Contradiction, Mosquito Indians in the Nicaraguan State, 1894 to 1987, published in 1996, of Más que un Indio, Racial Ambivalence and the Paradox of Neoliberal Multiculturalism in Guatemala, published in 2006. He is also co-editor of two other books, or at least two other books, I'm not sure. One, Racismo en Guatemala, abriendo debate sobre un tema tabú, and Memorias del Mestizaje, Cultura y Política en Centroamérica. He is the editor of the volume Engaging Contradictions, Theory, Politics, and Methods of Activist Scholarship. And finally, in the interest of time, he was president of WASA from 2006 to 2007. And he'll speak tonight on Racial Eruptions, the Awkward Place of Blackness, in Indian-centered spaces of Mestizaje. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be inaugurating this series, and this project, which I'm very excited about. Thank you to Carmen and Pamela for the enthusiasm and vision to initiate this project. And it's great to see a number of people, friends, acquaintances, colleagues here. Thanks for coming a beautiful New York afternoon, and also happy Dia de la Mujer, International Women's Day. The talk may not be the very most appropriate for this day, but hopefully there'll be some connections that you'll make and draw out in the discussion. This is a paper that I've been working on for quite some time and really haven't presented publicly. It decides to colleagues at the University of Texas, and it grows out of a dialogue that's very much, I don't know how much it happens in other places, but very particular to the cluster of faculty and graduate students we have at Texas, thinking about issues of comparative racial formation, racisms, and particularly I've gotten drawn into, as a scholar of indigenous politics, through this dialogue and thinking much more about the relationship to a whole parallel body of scholarship emerging from the African diaspora, and struggling together with others on trying to figure out how those two strands of work speak to each other, engage one another, and productively move common debates forward that often are happening in isolation from one another. And it is the reason I've been working on it, it hasn't come out, I haven't presented it, is because I felt it to be a bit speculative, and so I'm glad for particularly Pamela's enthusiasm and encouraging me to present it here, and very much forward to your critical commentary and discussion afterwards, if we still have energy. In October 1991, during the final day of the Continental Encounter in Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, the anti-quincentenary movement underwent a historic transformation. In the course of the previous 2 days, a lone Afro-Brazilian delegate had spoken persistently in the plenary, insisting that black people be included in the movement's name. Some, such as a Cuban and Dominican delegate in a small group discussion that I participated in, referenced here my fill notes, objected. The Cuban said, blacks as a people do not exist. Why should we create them? The Dominican agreed. And there was some mediation and some further discussion. But mainly the proposal elicited scattered mutterings of discomfort and bemusement, little debate, and a general stance of tolerance. To a large extent, the proposal served as a diversion from the major fault line at that encounter, and indeed in the movement as a whole, between left-aligned indigenous militants known as populares and those who sought liberation through the empowerment of indigenous people, or indianistas. In the end, the Afro-Brazilians' persistence paid off, if only because no one had a good reason for opposition. From that time on, the movement would be called Indigenous, Popular, and Black Continental Movement against the Quincentenary. Although analysts at the time may well have taken this name change as a propitious, if timid, step toward interracial coalition building, hindsight yields a more sober appraisal. In the 2 decades since 1991, we've seen relatively few solid instances of coalition and common struggle among black and indigenous peoples of Latin America, and a disturbing rise of forces that deepen the divisions between them. These forces come in 4 categories. Regimes of multicultural governance, though explicitly supportive of collective rights grounded in cultural difference, tend to accentuate hierarchies among black and indigenous people who claim these rights. On-the-ground conflicts between the 2 groups over resources, political power, and cultural political voice are ubiquitous and quite possibly on the rise. The conceptual frames that social scientists use to analyze black and indigenous struggles remain, with some notable exceptions, created to fit one group, encompassing the other only through awkward, homogenizing gloss, or more often still, simply ignoring them. At times, these conceptual frames actively reinforce, inadvertently or otherwise, the very inequities that they are meant to elucidate. Finally, and most important to the focus of this talk, the cultural political sensibilities of the actors themselves have followed quite distinct ontologies, each powerful and persuasive in its own right, but starkly distanced from one another. This does not mean that the struggles are losing ground, much to the contrary. Black and indigenous mobilization appears to be in a general, if uneven, 2-decade ascent. But if the Quetzaltenango meeting were to be restaged today, I suspect discussions of black-indigenous relations would be charged with an added increment of tension, and assertions of racial unity would be that much harder to swallow. The purpose of this talk is twofold. First, responding to calls dating back at least a decade and building on a number of important recent efforts, I hope to advance the theoretical proposition that the cultural politics of black and indigenous peoples are best understood through a conceptual frame that encompasses both from the start. What better setting to put this proposition to test than the puzzle of persistent tensions and perhaps mildly deteriorating relations between the 2 people? Second, I want this theoretical insight to emerge from and also contribute to ongoing efforts of activist research in favor of rights to land and resources among indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in Central America. In particular, I focus here on a cluster of Mestizaje Indian and Garifuna Afro-indigenous communities in northeastern Honduras, whose overlapping territorial claims and general political economic relations have been the source of considerable tension in recent years. While the full scope and details of the land rights research cannot be presented here, my general contention is that activist research not only attempts to generate knowledge useful in advancing on-the-ground struggles, but also, potentially, privilege and insight into theoretical problems like this one. Activist research always begins at home, perhaps especially so when the topic involves race. To be attuned to the politics of research requires a dual line of scrutiny, not only to the researcher's relations with the actors themselves, but also to the politics of knowledge production wherever he or she lives and works. In this case, home is University of Texas, although I don't yet, after 16 years, consider myself a Texan. I'm not sure when that's going to happen. And to some extent, US-based social science. 2 quick points will have to suffice. First, the racial positionality of social science research on these 2 peoples is deeply asymmetrical. The The vast majority of those who study Latin American indigenous politics are white North Americans, some are white or mestizo Latin Americans, and very few are indigenous. Among social scientists who study Afro-Latin politics, a significant group is of African descent, and these scholars have exerted an important, distinctive influence on our thinking about the topic. A sharpened analysis of racism and racial hegemonies, a heightened focus on race-conscious political organizing, born in a basic understanding of how necessary this is to the contestation of racism. This is not to claim, of course, that racial identity determines research topics or outcomes, but rather that racial positionality matters systematically in the empirical and theoretical facets of our scholarship, and that these conditions of racial positionality have a politics of their own. A second asymmetry follows, which has to do with scholars' particular entree to the topic of interracial relations between black and indigenous. I'm struck by the pattern, too consistent to be a coincidence, that nearly all prominent efforts of late to view black and indigenous peoples through a unified conceptual lens have come from scholars like Mark Anderson, Ted Gordon, Juliette Hooker, Bettina Nebueno, Peter Wade, whose research began focusing primarily on Afro-descendant peoples. And please, if you have good counterexamples, I'd love to hear them. Scholars of indigenous cultural politics, by contrast, are much more apt to leave the unified lens question well enough alone. This makes my interest in the topic, as a white scholar who's worked primarily on indigenous politics, somewhat anomalous. The anomaly is explained both by long-term involvements in Central America, where the need to understand black-indigenous relations was thrust upon us, and later by alignments at the University of Texas with black-identified theoretical approaches and academic politics. Those who have worked on comparative racial formation in Latin America, including those that I just mentioned, have made important advances, and I won't rehearse those advances here, I do in the written version of the paper, while leaving us with some gnawing, unresolved problems. We still only have a sketchy understanding of why black and indigenous peoples have developed on the whole such different styles of cultural political struggle. Why the politicization of race so consistently marks Afro-descendant mobilization, in contrast to indigenous movements' equally consistent preference for the politicization of culture. Why do these differences so often engender tension, and why do social scientists find it so difficult to place both peoples and their politics in the same analytical frame? The central existing explanation, which focuses primarily on the effects of national-level racial hegemonies, I want to suggest, is valid but incomplete. This explanation, which I associate with racial formation theory, posits the following. Dominant ideologies of Mestizaje portray indigenous culture as the font of national identity, and indigenous people as potential citizens who need to be civilized through assimilation to the national norm. These same ideologies tend to portray black people as incapable of producing culture, essentially foreign, always suspect, to be assimilated only through radical deracination. Against this backdrop, indigenous peoples' politicization of culture and rights to peoplehood reflects the influence of mestizo hegemony they are struggling against. In contrast, the explanation portrays black people's politicization of race as a means to combat racism and to improve their political economic position, strengthened by an outright refusal to reduce black empowerment to the recognition and practice of black culture. While affirming the fundamental premise that race is socially constructed, this racial formation argument yields a succinct conclusion, which I'd like to revisit. As long as racial hierarchy persists, the argument goes, to refuse race as a category of analysis, identification, and struggle is a fateful concession to racism. To politicize culture instead of race, beyond the bare-bones notion that culture is what people in question produce, draw, and practice, is a less direct but equally faithful concession to that same racial hegemony. I want to argue here that this conclusion does not go far enough in exploring processes of collective self-making and resistance in which both groups engage, and it pays insufficient attention to the entanglement of hegemony and self-making, which inevitably marks all processes of resistance to oppression. Equally important, this conclusion, when applied to on-the-ground context of black-indigenous relations, tends to deepen tensions rather than open pathways toward common cause. This effect alone does not mean that the analysis is flawed, but it does fuel my hopeful conviction that we can do better. Taking up this challenge, my argument is the following. I affirm the insights of racial formation theory focused on the differential interpolation of black and indigenous peoples, which has accentuated hierarchies between the two. I go on to argue that racial formation analysis needs to pay greater attention to the volatility of racial signification, to the work that race does in the political imaginary of dominant and subordinate peoples alike, and in particular to the repercussions of this volatility in relations among subordinate racial groups. To explore and substantiate these effects, I introduced the idea of racial eruptions, and used the concept to explore the awkward and often perplexing presence of racialized premises about blackness in Indian-centered spaces of Mestizaje. I argue that in many parts of Latin America, for mestizos and Indians alike, race has come to be coded as black. Only if we understand such coding as a product of both indigenous resistance and of racial hegemony, I contend, can we move forward in confronting what I call the race-culture predicament in black-indigenous relations. I conclude that race and culture conjoined, not pried apart, could provide a powerful conceptual basis for common struggle against racism, for mutually affirmed collective rights, and against the subtle persistence of white supremacy in this era of neoliberal multiculturalism. I'm not sure what the keyword of this race-culture conjunction might turn out to be. I think it's likely to emerge from struggles now underway in places like northeastern Honduras, where both peoples occupy the same space and face the urgent necessity of working together if either is going to survive. Okay, here goes racial eruptions. Until not very long ago, race was a category that states and social scientists applied to indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples alike, with little self-consciousness or hesitation. There's always, in Latin America I'm speaking, there's always been differentiation, to be sure, from the first moments of European conquest and colonization onward. But the idea of Indians and blacks as races and the closely associated premises of racial inferiority as rationale and explanation for racial hierarchy are a constitutive feature of New World modernity, and most certainly a key feature of Latin American nation building since the 19th century. Perhaps the widespread awareness of differential racialization, beginning with Las Casas' famous endorsement of African enslavement to advance his project to save Indian souls, has diverted our attention from how recent and oddly one-sided the abandonment of overt racial categorization for Indians turns out to have been. The shift took place sometime in the 1960s. Indians began the decade interpolated as tribes and in the aggregate as members of an Indian race. And by the decade's end, they had become ethnics. Black Latin Americans, by contrast, tended to remain resolutely racial. If we're to fully understand why the ethnic shift applied so readily to indigenous people and not to blacks, we must also take seriously their distinctive styles of resistance and self-making. This in turn has led me to ask a prior question. What happened to the idea of race among indigenous people who live in places where black Latin Americans are largely absent? That is, places where the mutually enabling ideologies of Mestizaje and ethnicity theory took hold. I begin with an exploratory answer to this question, and then come back to the prior question. So there's embedded in this is a critique of ethnicity theory, which I don't really go into here, but hopefully we can talk about more if need be. With the shift to the ethnicity frame, racial analytics remain only in the negative. We know that anti-Indian racism did not suddenly recede just because Indians turned ethnic. To the contrary, the shift coincided with the rise of national-level indigenous mobilization, which engendered a heightened awareness of anti-Indian racism, and eventually entailed the refusal of the ethnic appellation as well. But this circumscribed language of anti-racist But beyond the circumscribed language of anti-racist critique, the shift banished racial analytics in academic realms, in state discourse, and in the consciousness of activist intellectuals themselves. I want us to explore how, despite this widespread abandonment, race remained embedded in political imaginaries, dominant and subordinate alike, prescribed but powerful. And in its most visceral form, as I said, race came to be coded as black. One way to substantiate this assertion is to examine what I'm provisionally calling racial eruptions. These are bursts of signification where a given understanding of race is conveyed, and where that understanding typically goes uncontested because it comes directly from the political imaginary, does its work in that realm, and recedes in the face of critical scrutiny, often with a disavowal or a dismissive, "You misunderstood." Because they come and go in this liminal space, racial eruptions are could be a means to access the workings of racial hegemony. In the Indian-centered spaces of Mestizaje that concern me here, racial eruptions that evoke blackness are especially revealing because they're so out of place, so excessive. They may also be especially influential because there are few or no black people around even to begin the long, arduous process of contestation. Let me first present some relatively mild images from a bottle of cooking oil from Guatemala and from Ecuador. And I realize that Ecuador may not quite work in my argument because, of course, there are Afro-Ecuadorians, but I'm thinking in terms of a kind of a regional differentiation here. A restaurant, and a popular brand of rum. In the United States, these images would be widely considered to be denigrating stereotypes, especially the restaurant, Menestas del Negro. Yet the cooking oil, Mammy, is ultimately the most revealing. There are no black people in Guatemala except for small and regionally isolated Garifuna community in Livingston. Virtually no one who has used aceite ideal, even going back 2 or 3 generations, has ever been served by a black domestic servant. Yet the image seems to form part of the racial common sense, which comes and goes without saying. These images bring to mind the recent uproar over Memín Pingüín in Mexico, where the widespread critique from across the political spectrum in the United States was taken by many Mexicans as the epitome of cultural misunderstanding and affront to national pride. Even without exploring the fine details of this dispute, 2 salient points emerge. In Indian-centered spaces of Mestizaje, there's a strikingly high tolerance for denigrating racial stereotypes of blacks. Analogous stereotypic images of Indians circulate in these spaces, but they're less common, less blatant, and more contested. The unself-conscious circulation of analogous images of mestizos, Frito Bandito, for example, is today almost unthinkable. The place of blackness in Mexico Mestizo is especially important for the argument developed here, because in Mexico the ideology of mestizaje is so pervasive, with such strong historic roots. The eminent historian Enrique Krause offered a typical rendition of this position in a commentary on debate generated by the Zapatista uprising of 1994. Mexico has many problems, but it also has many non-problems. One of the latter is ethnicity. This is quite a quote. I've been thinking about this ever since I read it 10 years ago. It's been said that our country is racist. What is racism? These people should ask a Jew who survived Nazism. They should ask orphans and widows of Bosnia, or the 500,000 blacks who marched on the Capitol in Washington. Physical disgust is how Emilio Rabasa defined it, and he should have known. Not because he felt it, but because he saw it up close in his birthplace, the state of Chiapas, where he later became governor. The Maya zone is the principal exception, not the only one, that confirms the rule of Mexican history. Mestizaje was a blessing. For some time now, a growing contingent of intellectuals and activists have challenged this mestizaje as blessing orthodoxy, to the point where Krause himself might well revise his statement today. Yet the same revision has hardly begun in relation to the small and regionally isolated Afro-Mexican population. Carlos Monsiváis, of unquestionable leftist credentials, in a recent commentary on the Memin Penguin controversy, defends this contrast pointedly. Mexican readers from 60 years back or last year would never have tolerated an openly racist comic. The comics of Mexico have been profoundly machista, but not anti-black, in a country where black is understood to mean dark skin. Profound racism is reserved for Indians, in keeping with a Creole mentality that portrays Indians as uncivilized beings incapable of ever living up to God-given Hispanic linguistic and cultural norms. If Monsiváis is right that black Mexicans have avoided the racial opprobrium inflicted on Indians, then a major historical puzzle follows. Why did Mestizaje ideology become a bendición for one racially subordinated group and a maldición for the other? In any case, before taking Monsiváis' assertion as the final word, we might look more closely at subtle or implicit premises which reside in the political imaginary. As a small contribution to such an effort, I offer the billboard in the Colonia Reforma of Oaxaca, ostensibly raised to congratulate the soon-to-be first black president of the United States. Congratulations, Barack Obama, candidate for president of the United States. Blacks should stop wasting time lamenting the horrors of the past and instead roll up their sleeves to get to work, like the Hispanics have. So it is a quote from Vargas Llosa, which is another twisted turn that I have. It's difficult to miss the echoes of President Vicente Fox's notorious defense of Mexican migrants to the U.S., saying that they take, quote, trabajo que ni siquiera los negros aceptan. To continue this line of inquiry, I make a foray into Latin American literature, examining a passage that has perplexed me for a number of years. The novel is Los Ríos Profundos by José María Arguedas, and the passage in question is set deep in the Peruvian highlands at a Catholic boarding school in the small provincial town of Abancay. The protagonist, Ernesto, narrates a protracted scuffle between a group of boarding school boys and a friar named Brother Miguel. The novel is filled with charged, earthy, and at times vulgar racial cultural imagery involving Indians, cholos, mestizos, and whites, playing extensively on the tension between sharp hierarchy and blurred boundaries among them all. This episode is different, however, because Brother Miguel has dark, or is it darker, skin and kinky hair. Brother Miguel has punished two boys by making them walk on bloody knees to the chapel. The headmaster priest appears and the boys appeal to him for help. El negro, padre, el negro abusivo, gritó enfurecido. El hermano no le permitió levantarse. El director no pudo caminar muy rápido porque Añuco le prendió de un brazo. El negro, repetía atolondrado, ahogándose con lágrimas. El padre le tapó la boca y lo sacudió. As the narrative unfolds, one of the boys explained how the incident began. Porque le marcó un foul nada más, le agarró del hombre y le dijo, negro, negro de mierda. El hermano no sé cómo, se levantó, le dio un puñete y la sangre chispeó de toda su cara. Finally, the headmaster resolves the matter, reprimanding both Brother Miguel and the boys, and orchestrates a rite where each would ask forgiveness of the other. Lleras, the boy, refuses. No, gritó Lleras. No, es negro, padrecito, es negro, atatuya, atauya. In the English language translation, this passage grows more complex and troubling still, because the translator uses the N-word to render the Spanish language term negro. Since racial insult is daily fare in Arguedas' rendering of the Peruvian Sierra, one could view this scuffle with Brother Miguel as an unremarkable continuation of the pattern. Yet in my view, the visceral charge of this racial eruption seems perplexingly excessive and out of place. I actually wrote various Arguedas scholars, and I couldn't get them to engage, the ones I wrote, with this problem, so I'm still perplexed. Where did Lleras, a poor dark-skinned Serrano, himself racialized as Indian, learned to be physically disgusted by blackness. Where did he learn the N-word? Or an equally unsettling line of inquiry, what led this eminent translator of Latin American literature to render the term negro in this way? I will leave these questions hanging for a moment and move back to the Guatemalan highlands, another Indian-centered space of Mestizaje. I just completed a book-length study on the dominant culture of people in Bolivia, that's the next one, Pamela. Dominant culture in Guatemala, known as Ladinos, and their responses to Maya effervescence, a combination of individual and collective assertion that contests racism, demands equality, and pursues collective rights grounded in cultural difference. One of the most striking features of my interviews with Ladinos, not every interview, but common enough to cry out for interpretation, was that when I asked about their relations with Mayas, they responded by mentioning black people. At times, such associations were triggered by my own racial identity and their misconceived gestures of racial solidarity, as in Don Orlando's reflection on the internal armed conflict of the 1970s. Sí, era una cosa netamente racial, Don Orlando says. Es un problema serio que tenemos, lo mismo que ustedes tienen con los negros. At other times, however, the context defied this interpretation. When I asked Genaro Melgar, is there racism in your milieu? He responded this way. De todas formas, la discriminación yo lo miro como algo natural. Todos discriminados por sexo, color, etc. Si no es exagerado, es normal. Es normal, por ejemplo, que uno no quisiera que su hija se case con un gran negro que no quiere trabajar o nada. Es un choque natural, pero aquí no se da tanto. No es de vida y muerte. Melgar's racial eruption is extreme, but consistent with an array of scattered ethnographic tidbits, which I'm just beginning to analyze in a systematic manner. Jokes playing on stereotypic racist premises about black people, stories about black predators in Indian communities in the dark of night, political imaginaries with elaborations of blackness, remarkably detailed given that many probably had never seen a real live black person, except on television. Out of sight definitely does not mean out of mind. The last piece of evidence I'll offer would be the most conclusive if it were not at the same time so utterly bewildering. During my field research in Chimaltenango, I had the opportunity to observe from start to precipitous finish a localized social movement that arose to protest property taxes, corruption, inadequate city services, especially water, and general unresponsiveness of the recently elected mayor. The movement's composition was heterogeneous, including both indigenous and Ladino townspeople, and its ideology highly eclectic. Its racial politics were complicated not only by this heterogeneity, but also by the fact that the mayor was Maya, a member of the official party of neoliberal leanings, and widely known to be a heavy drinker. This portrayal in Ladino descriptions of those who opposed him often fused with the standard racist stereotype of the Indian drunkard. Movement leaders held many heated meetings and organized a few marches and protests outside the mayor's office, all of which I dutifully attended and recorded. In its culminating weeks, the movement clamored for the mayor's resignation. Still, all this careful ethnography did not prepare me for the graffitis spray painted on the mayor's door during the final protest outside his office. We want water, don't be a thief, black son of a whore. Now I face the same quandary as our Gaius' translator. Should I translate negro hijo de puta using the N-word? If so, where on earth did that signification come from? Even if my literal translation is more accurate, what does it mean that the person who produced this graffiti chose the word negro to express his repudiation of an indigenous mayor? I have 3 lines of explanation for these racial eruptions, none meant to crowd out the other 2, all highly speculative and much in need of further work. The first, transnational circulation of racial significations, is the most well established, if a little hard to pin down. It certainly works well to interpret some of the racial eruptions cited here, observing that basic premises about Indians and blacks circulate in a realm that reaches well beyond a given nation state. And from this transnational space, these premises exert a powerful influence on racial sensibilities in a given locale. The mass media would be the principal means of diffusion, supplemented perhaps by widely circulating literary works, circular migrations, and other transnational flows of ideas and artistic expression. A second line of explanation focuses more specifically on the place of blackness within Indian centers' ideologies of Mestizaje in historical terms. Revisionist historical demographic analyses in country after country have brought to our attention how numerous people of African descent were in colonial and early Republican times. Great study by Chris Lutz on the city of Antigua, Guatemala. Justin Wolfe has worked on this in Nicaragua, etc., etc. This line of inquiry focuses on the afterlives of race mixture, even in places where this demographic transformation has long been consummated, such as Highland Guatemala. Does the ideology of Mestizaje, ostensibly based on the fusion of indigenous and European traits to yield the hardy fusion known as mestizo, or Ladino, incorporate premises about blackness even as it denies the black contribution to the racial cultural mix? A third and final hypothesis builds on these first 2, but incorporates an element of indigenous agency and brings us back to the first question. That is, why the move from race to ethnicity happens so swiftly for indigenous people in stark contrast to Afro-Latinos. Without denying the differential racialization argument, another part of the answer I'm suggesting has to do with the contours of indigenous collective self-making and resistance. Confronted with overt racial opprobrium beginning in the 1960s, Indian peoples fashioned national strategies of resistance, drawing on what Silvio Rivera Cusicanqui has called the memoria larga of rebellious cultural politics dating back 5 centuries. Especially since contemporary ideologies in Mestizaje portray indigenous culture as both inferior and as an inspired font of modern national identity, a clear strategic path emerged. Resist racial opprobrium, repudiate the very category of race, recuperate indigenous identity grounded in a culture of resistance, claim collective rights based on militant assertion of this cultural difference. From here, it is but a small additional step to suggest that the repudiation of race as a category that applied to Indians could have involved an implicit endorsement of race as a category that did apply to black people. If so, then the more successful the opposition to race as an anti-Indian construct, the more this left race to be coded as black. As this implicit coding takes hold, it can be expected that the denigrating significations mapped onto blackness would seep back in as well. This hypothesis is meant to pose questions and might drive further research rather than provide confident answers. Can it be demonstrated that indigenous people in Indian-centered spaces of Mestizaje tend to code race as black and accept without active dissent an array of deprecatory premises about blackness? I have a graduate student who just finished her dissertation on the poultry industry in Mississippi, which as of a couple years ago, 10 years ago, has recruited mainly workers from Central America, including many indigenous Guatemalans. And one of the things that she noticed is how indigenous Guatemalans arrived almost with a notion of where in the racial hierarchy they were fitting in relation to blacks and whites, without having been there more than a couple of weeks. And that's the kind of idea I'm getting at here. A second part of this same research agenda involves an analogous line of inquiry focused on Afro-Latin self-making and resistance and its relationship to indigeneity. It is abundantly clear to me why the politicization of race is central to most processes of Afro-Latin American resistance, but I have less understanding of why politicized assertions of distinctive black culture parallel to those of indigenous people, have not emerged as well, conjoined with racial militancy as a doubly powerful claim to rights. There are, of course, myriad processes of collective organization around the recuperation, valorization, and affirmation of African diasporic culture throughout Latin America. But there are relatively few cases where this cultural affirmation has been used to advance and justify claims for citizenship rights. And in exceptional cases where this does happen, the Afro-Colombians of the Chocó, for example, amply documented in Arturo Escobar's new book, they generally invoke Indian-like cultural premises and practice as a point of reference. Could it be that both Afro-Latins and their indigenous counterparts have incorporated key precepts of the very racial hegemony they're resisting? If so, then mere opposite expressions of the same race-culture disarticulation could lie at the root of tensions between the two. This is a very much shorter piece, for those of you who might be worried about how long it's going to go on, that shifts attention now to Honduras. Garifuna and Mosquito struggles for territory in a remote, globalized corner of Honduras. This conclusion that I just mentioned, which moves from the meaning of a scattered collection of racial eruptions to implications for understanding tensions between black and indigenous peoples of Latin America, is frankly speculative. It marks the limits of my own understanding of the problem. To push the analysis further, I turn to the ongoing experiences of activist research in a setting where the actors themselves are confronting variants of these very issues in the course of efforts to fend off threats to their livelihood. I've carried out this research collectively with lawyers, geographers, and other anthropologists on a series of black and indigenous struggles for territory in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Honduras. This particular site is located in northeastern Honduras, and the key actors are the Mosquito, an indigenous people who inhabit this region of Honduras and Nicaragua, and the Garifuna, an Afro-indigenous people who live along the Caribbean coast of Central America from Belize to Nicaragua. In Honduras, our research teams worked in close alignment with Mosquito and Garifuna political organizations, MASTA and OFRNE respectively, and with community leaders to map the lands they have traditionally occupied and to document cultural meanings and economic practices, thereby contributing to efforts to secure state-recognized territorial rights. The principal obstacles to these rights are large landholders, tourist enterprises, mainly foreign-owned, state policies of various sorts, and increasingly narco-entrepreneurs. In this case, however, an additional complication is an overlap between the two claims, that is, Mosquito claim and the Garifuna claim, of approximately 16,000 hectares. Rather than focusing on the details of the mapping research and the many technical and political dimensions of the Latin American-wide territorial turn that underlies it, I want to reflect specifically on the politics of this overlap. There are long-standing tensions between the Mosquito and the Garifuna, a context from which this problem emerges and to which it directly contributes. Four dimensions are crucial. The first is the role of mestizos, and behind them the state, who run the socioeconomic gamut from impoverished campesino migrants to landholders, merchants, and politicians. In recent years, relatively powerful mestizos have helped to drive the wedge deeper between Mosquito and Garifuna by strategically affirming Mosquito claims to anteriority, to indigenous people were here first, and promising support for the Mosquito predicated on their distancing themselves from the Garifuna. A Mestizo store owner provided me with a prime illustration of this logic. I am native. My grandfather was born in Palacios, a town right in the middle of that little map I just showed you. I'm Ladino from Palacios. When Columbus first arrived here, he named it the Coast of the Long-Eared People, which is a reference to the Indians. The Garifuna arrived much later as slaves. We took them in, and for a long time the three of us were united. Now there are problems. The previous mayor showed preference, the previous mayor was Garifuna, showed preference only to the Garifuna. The Mosquito and the Ladinos nativos are not selfish like that. We responded by making an alliance against the Garifuna. The second factor is multilateral institutions like the World Bank that contribute to this fragmentation in a textbook enactment of neoliberal multiculturalism. For example, as this local conflict was unfolding, the World Bank offered funding for a newly formed network of indigenous organizations on the condition that expressly excluded the more radicalized and contestatory Garifuna. Third, there's a general climate of disapproval of black identity politics, which at times takes on the excessive features of a racial eruption. Consider, for example, these inflammatory statements by a Lenca Indian legislature to a reporter. I don't think I need to read it. It's more of the same. I think I'll just let you read it from the screen. Finally, drawing on my but the fact that he's an indigenous legislator who's making public statements to the press along the lines is quite intense, I thought. Finally, the Garifuna started a campaign to get him out of office, and I don't know what the results of that campaign were, but these comments were widely contested and circulated. Finally, drawing on my observations and those of geographer Charlene Mollet, who worked in the area at a similar time, we can point to ways in which both the Garifuna and the Mosquito drew on dominant racial ideologies to justify and legitimate their respective positions. The Mosquito critique of the Garifuna claim was laced with anti-black sentiment, Mollet reports, while the Garifuna drew on standard racialized depictions of Indians as primitive and capable of negotiating the rigors of modernity, etc., to make their case. Even without delving further into the particulars, it should be clear how this conflict and its broader context neatly, if somewhat depressingly, encapsulate my argument. There are widely circulating premises that denigrate blackness, which Indians themselves have absorbed and which they regularly perform. Among these premises stand the key assertion that black people do not produce authentic and recognizably distinct culture, which makes their claims to rights based on cultural difference already suspect. There are periodic racial eruptions when these premises come forcefully to the fore, although the tensions do not prevail necessarily in the daily flow of cultural political practice, characterized by a reasonable degree of tolerance and sociability. However, as the pace of political mobilization quickens, these premises grow more prominent and the tensions deepen, surely because material resources are at stake, but in part also with an intensity that seems to overflow the specific logic of the conflict itself. Intercultural dialogue and political negotiation, some of which our research team played a role in, has not produced much hope for a resolution to the specific territorial dispute, but it has propelled us to think a lot about how the underlying problem might be productively addressed. The Garifuna are in an especially privileged position to forge a constructive path forward, I contend, because their Afro-Indigenous history and identity confound the race-culture dichotomy that lies at the heart of the problem. The Garifuna are interpolated as black and are constantly subject to anti-black racism, yet at least in the strand of mobilization championed by Ofernay, their resistance and political demands are grounded in assertions of indigenous cultural difference. This means that they are in general deeply invested in naming and opposing both anti-Indian and anti-black racism, a stance that is uncommon among indigenous rights activists, the Mosquito included. From this heterogeneous stance of collective resistance, it's a small additional step for the Garifuna to affirm the conjoined place of both race and culture in their political repertoire. This is not to claim that such a position has been fully articulated, but rather that each of the parts are at times present and there are occasional flashes where the whole becomes visible. From there, it's a plausible additional step to imagine the Mosquito adopting an analogous position, grounded in indigenous identity. In any case, it's become clear to me that concrete work on the conjoined processes of racial and cultural politics is an indispensable counterpart to the technical and micro-political challenge of finding a negotiated solution to the 16,000 hectare overlap. Conclusions. Two theorists of whiteness, George Lipsitz and Robin Weigman, have suggested recently that, quote, that the, quote, anti-racist white subject in a racist society is an impossibility. My argument here about black indigenous relations in Latin America ends with a similar question. The point of their provocation, of course, is not to deny that many white people are anti-racist, or to discourage those inclined to adopt anti-racist politics. It's simply to draw attention to the inevitable gap between individual intentions and structures of racial hierarchy, and to remind white anti-racists that we are also products of the racial hegemony that we seek to struggle against. Although this may sound like an awfully gloomy conclusion, from another perspective it could be taken as constructive in practical and strategic terms, perhaps even uplifting. Instead of encouraging white anti-racists to hold out for just the right context when our lofty ideals and the broader conditions of political struggle neatly coincide, it instructs us to engage the here and now and do the best we can with the welter of contradictions that this engagement is sure to entail. My analogous question is, are egalitarian black indigenous coalition politics impossible? Here also the seemingly gloomy answer in the affirmative might free us up to think about how to move forward toward precisely that end. The argument is sound only if we start out naming the powerful forces of interpolation that gave rise to this paradox in the first place, an account that racial formation theory is well positioned to provide. This analysis in turn opens onto a well-known proposed course of political action, that both peoples politicize race, contest racism, join together in struggle for racial empowerment, letting cultural practices follow as they will. While generally sympathetic to this perspective, I argue here that it's neither analytically complete nor politically viable. Analytically, it does not take fully into account the differential patterns of self-making and resistance in which black indigenous Latin Americans engage. Politically, it increases the likelihood that the mobilization of one group will be predicated on the depreciation or even delegitimation of the other. A possible way forward, suggested by the notion of racial eruptions, is to assume that the predominant forms of political assertion of subordinate peoples will entail some degree of endorsement of hegemonic racial precepts, intertwined with the very cultures of resistance they have forged. Under these conditions, the challenge is to understand the dynamics of this entwinement and to critique the workings of hegemony without allowing this critique to obscure the liberatory potential of their political agency. Concretely, this is a call for analysis of indigenous politics, for analysts of indigenous politics and indigenous activist intellectuals themselves to develop a robust analysis of race, not only as critique of anti-Indian racism, which is already present, not necessarily as the basis for self-identification, which would be an unwarranted imposition from the outside, but rather racial analysis is a means to guide the struggle against the premises of anti-black racism embedded in the ideologies of Mestizaje and in Indian political subjectivities themselves. Just to be clear, my question about the impossibility of egalitarian black indigenous relations does not endorse this outcome, but simply asks where the best place is to start in confronting its consequences. Admittedly, this is a far cry from the utopian visions of racial unity which all race progressive people harbor. It should not be construed as an abandonment of those visions, much less a capitulation to the racial hegemonies of our times. It's an argument, in essence, not to let critique impede active engagement with the contradictory fields that we have no choice but to till. It asks us to moderate our critique of how indigenous peoples' politicization of culture involve the abandonment of race as category of self-identification. This might in turn allow us to refocus critical energies on conditions that have prevented Afro-descendant peoples from developing a parallel discourse of collective rights grounded in cultural difference, and most important, it would train a bright light on the premises in both indigenous and mestizo imaginaries that persist in coding race as black and imbuing blackness with inferiority. This proposal envisions two differently constituted claims for rights, two substantively different styles of anti-racist politics, which might enable one another from a respectful distance, no longer posing a constant threat of mutual delegitimation. Thank you.